indeed sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine. It's a key argument for Mitchell, that this wasn't an act of providence. This was a man-made famine, and it was made in Whitehall. And it was a famine by design to reform and restructure the Irish people. What this leads to is Mitchell's call for a new type of political economy that would be specifically Irish, and he publishes this tract called The Irish Political Economy in 1847. And the argument there becomes a hugely important one. It's an argument that says that, look, the British think that liberal political economy provides universal laws. The ideas of liberal political economy are true across the world, that they're true in all times and all places. And he's saying this is just not true. Liberal political economy is great for the British Empire, but it's very, very bad for everywhere else, and it's a product of the comparative advantage that the British Empire has given to the British. Nobody else has that type of comparative advantage. Free trade doesn't make sense for anybody else. So he's saying, look, free trade, liberal political economy is not a universal truth that cannot be unquestioned. It's a product of a particular time and place. And other nations need to have different systems to protect their own economies against the bloodthirsty English free trade system. And this is a criticism and an argument that is developed by many other people in the following 70 years, not least other colonial nationalist figures in India, but also by the German political economist Friedrich List, of whom more in a moment. Okay, so actually I did the famine in 10 minutes. Not bad at all. Let's go to the Great Exhibition, which is mainly going to be lots of pretty pictures. So we've done the miserable bit. This is now the Adam Smith, everything's right in the world, trade is bringing wealth and prosperity to all. As I said at the very start, the Great Exhibition is the world's first trade fair. It's held in Hyde Park, the big park in the middle of London, but you don't know that. And in this building, known as the Crystal Palace. Here is an image of it. Giant building, huge, huge building. Not only massive, but just as importantly, made out of glass and steel. The world's first ever building made of glass and steel. This was an exhibition that was meant to provide a monument to the benefits of free trade and the prosperity it could bring to the world. So within that Crystal Palace, the reason why it was so big was because there were displays of raw materials, of manufactured goods, of machinery, and all of those were housed within those walls. 100,000 exhibits, 14,000 exhibitors, and it's claimed 6 million visitors during the summer that it was opened. It was opened by Queen Victoria, of course, on the 1st of May, 1851, and ran through the rest of the summer. Yeah. So imagine that you're a manufacturer, and you might have 5 machines that you want to put on show. So you might be, I'll give you a humble example, you might have a bathtub, a sink, and I think actually Thomas Crapper does provide the first ever porcelain basin for crapping in as well. So that's why there's that discrepancy. The Crystal Palace, I'm going to suggest, is basically a cathedral for the new type of liberal political economy. And you can read, and you really must read this terrific sermon on the Great Exhibition by George Clayton, where he says, it's a monument to national greatness, it's a stimulus to diligence and to industry, and it provides healthful and honourable forms of emulation. Okay? In other words, it provides a stimulus to the very things that you need to be a good, industrious, liberal individual. And we'll see more about that in a moment. One of the things the exhibition also does is stage the new division of labour between Britain and its empire. So here we see an image from the East India Court where you have basically a display of the luxuries that are available through the East India companies. The projection of the colonies is basically a source of superfine raw materials, but raw materials that need to come to Britain to be made into usable things. And it was the skilled labour of Britons and the mechanised forms of production that were meant to be the finishing part of the process. The empire was, if you like, nature's source. Here you have an image, is that very grainy? I can't really see. Here you have a really great image of the machinery court to show the sort of fascination with machines, large and wide, which was really, of course, what Britain was far advanced of every other country in. And the most important element of all of this is, of course, that some things were entirely absent. Okay? There's very, very little signs of Britain's agricultural economy in the Great Exhibition. Indeed, when they're trying to put the Great Exhibition together, there's an absolute dearth of interest by agriculturists. And in a way, it's not entirely surprising. They've just taken a big hit with the abolition of the Corn Laws, and they're thinking, well, this is an exhibition for the Manchester School people. This isn't our deal. So very little signs of Britain's agricultural sector at all. And of course, the other real absence, as you see from this cartoon from Punch, is labour. Somehow, labour just wasn't evident in the Great Exhibition. Indeed, Henry Vincent, one of the Chartist leaders, because although Chartism basically is defeated in 1848, it carries on for another decade or so, and Henry Vincent, one of the leaders of the leftover Chartists, described the Great Exhibition as symbolising, quote, plunder wrung from the people of all lands by their conquerors, the men of blood, privilege and capital. So again, there are alternative voices, but they are incredibly few and far between. The last point I want to say about the Great Exhibition is that, to return to the Reverend George Clayton's point about healthy emulation. Okay? The Great Exhibition wasn't just about the display of the fine goods and machines that were in the Crystal Palace. It was also about learning to emulate behaviour from each other. The sociologist Tony Bennett describes this as the exhibitionary complex. We go to art galleries, we go to museums, as much to look at each other, looking at the objects, as we do to go and observe the materials. And in the case of the Great Exhibition, as you can clearly see by George Clayton's sermon, the idea was that the less civilised would learn styles of behavior and comportment from the more civilized, that they would be given ambitions to become better people. And really a key part of that was the introduction of the shilling day, where, which you see an image of before, where you see this lovely image of working people confronting genteel ladies at the great exhibition. This wasn't going to be a confrontation of different classes. This was a coming together of different classes. It's a very important point, because 3 years earlier, the Chartists had led a potential mass meeting in the middle of London and hoped to lead a revolutionary push down to the Houses of Parliament that were quashed. So 3 years after that dramatic point of political conflict comes this image of classes being bound together and learning from each other, or at least the poor learning from their social betters. Okay, let's come to a conclusion. So the very first point I was trying to get across to you was how ingrained in the evangelical currents of thought political economy was. And I try to suggest to you that we can think of liberal political economy as much as a gospel as a science. And actually thinking of it in that way enables us to recognize exactly what Mitchell said, which was that it was a product of a very particular time and place. It wasn't the passing of tablets of stone down a mountain that would be true forever. I also tried to suggest to you that one of the key things that liberal political economy did was create not just a new sense of how people should be, what qualities people had to have to succeed in this new system, but they also created a new understanding of the market or of the economy as a whole. So for the first time, people thought of themselves as part of an economic system, rather than simply as working in a particular locality or in a particular trade. It had ways of conceiving of the economy as a total thing. And that certainly took shape increasingly in the second half of the 19th century, in the wake of The Economist and other publications like it, as well as Weights and Measures and Cash and all of that stuff. I've also tried to suggest to you that this system depended upon Britain's imperial position. The reason why I call this lecture An Empire with Free Trade is because arguably the free trade system developed by Britain in the 19th century could not have worked without the possession and acquisition of imperial of colonies, or even the use of informal types of imperialism. So, for instance, Britain came to depend upon Argentinian beef, imported Argentinian beef, sheep and cattle from Canada, which was part of the former empire, and Australia eventually as well. But Argentina was a really important source of foodstuffs for Britain, and particularly of beef. Argentina was never part of Britain's former empire. The American Midwest was where most of Britain's cheap corn came from in the second half of the 19th century, and yet Britain had given America independence not that much earlier. Come on, someone's going to have a go at me about that. So the point is that this imperial system creates a new type of division of labour across the world, where Britain's comparative advantage in certain areas allows for them to predominate in certain areas of trade. I've also tried to suggest to you that this era of free trade was relatively short. That is to say that the moment of its consolidation in the 1840s and 50s gave way very soon to the rise of new protectionist impulses in the 1870s. But, remember, I told you at the very beginning of this lecture that the central tenets of liberal political economy, the idea of cheap government, of free trade and the gold standard, all of those basically endure down to the 1920s and 1930s. In fact, Britain doesn't abandon free trade until 1931. Okay? So the point is, it endures because it came to represent not just an economic system, but a whole way of life, a whole moral view of the world and of Britain's place within it. Now, very quickly, heads up for next week. We're going to look at two other key elements of the Victorian world and of this liberal system. Okay? The first is the nature of the representative system. Who gets to vote how other forms of pressure are put to bear on Parliament and on government. Okay? Clearly, representative systems are essential to liberal forms of government, and they change in very interesting ways during the 19th century. And you'll be absolutely thrilled to hear that lecture is going to be delivered by a guest lecturer, Ryan Vieira, who's a specialist in that area, and I'm going to be down there with you finding out what it's like to sit on those seats. And then on Thursday, we're going to have a lecture about basically the position of women in this system, and the way in which social, economic, and political life were deeply gendered to the disadvantage of many, many women. So have a great section on Friday and Monday, and I'll see you next Tuesday.